Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Table and Plate Project Delta podcast. Each place has its own culture and vibe. And you're joining me, Dr. Ellen Harris, as I learn, explore, discover, experience, and talk about food and culture in the Mississippi Delta. Today, we're featuring the last Cookbook Club Sunday Dinner for 2024. Usually these dinners are held in person and virtually with friends in Mississippi and in other parts of the country. There's a theme, a featured cookbook, we talk, we share stories, we present the dish or meal that we prepared, we eat, and then we bid each other farewell until the next time. This year, we also added a segment where we discuss a pre-selected food-related book. In June, the book was Food Power Politics by Bobby J. Smith II. In August, the book was My Soul Looks Back by Jessica B. Harris. There have been a few twists and turns since our August dinner. Our next dinner should have been in October, but I lost my one and only older sister, and I went to Senegal, Africa, for the first time. Upon my return, I've been in kind of a funk, grieving my sister and the state of the country after the election. Anywho, the Capricorn in me says, Ellen, get off your butt, get your stuff together, and keep it moving. While I wasn't quite ready for hosting a dinner, I figured why not prepare something and talk a bit about the last book for this year, Slaves for Peanuts by Jori Lewis, and a little bit about my visit to Senegal, where the book is actually based. Since peanuts are part of our discussion, the dish I chose is a modified version of broken rice peanut seafood stew. This recipe can be found in Marcus Samuelsson's cookbook, The Rise, Black Cooks and the Soul of American Food. Never the one to completely follow a recipe, I always doctor things up or use what I have on hand. So this time around, I don't have the full complement of the actual recipe, but I do have some shrimp, some leftover baked chicken wings, and instead of the broken rice or grits, which I'm not particularly a fan of grits, I'm using quinoa. Part of our time together will be me sharing the preparation of the dish, and between and after, I'll share some thoughts. What I thought about the book, what I learned from it, and any major takeaways. And a little bit about my sojourn to Senegal. So let's begin. So I've got things prepared over here, and I'm going to move the camera to the stove area. And got everything set up here. And here we go. So the first thing is to put a little olive oil in the pot. And get it hot. I'm going to get a spoon. And then I've got my spices here. You're supposed to use fresh, but I don't have fresh. So I have garlic powder and I have ground ginger and I have dried chili peppers the peppers were actually grown in my garden and I dehydrated them and ground them up. So that's homegrown. And then I've got sweet potatoes, also the last harvest from my garden this fall, cut up in small cubes. I've got the quinoa, and then I've got coconut milk, and I'm supposed to have crushed tomatoes, but I don't have that, so I have a little tomato paste I'm going to use. And then the leftover chicken wings that I've cut up and shrimp. And then I have greens freshly picked this morning from my garden. You're supposed to use mustard greens, but I was only growing collards and kale. And I've already had one big harvest of greens. And this was just, I left the stalks in the raised bed. And so this is what has grown since early to mid-October. So they're baby greens, which means that they're going to be very tender. And so I'm going to use them instead of mustard greens. And then off to the side, I've got peanut butter and fish sauce, which will be added with the greens last. So the olive oil has gotten hot. And I'm going to add garlic powder and the ginger to simmer a bit. And I've got to take care with my chili peppers because these boogers are hot. So, and I tend to be heavy-handed, so I have to really watch that, but just a little pinch. Simmer that. Turn the fire down a little bit. And I'm going to add the potato and the quinoa. Just toast them a bit, mixing the spices around them. Toasting, continuing to toast a bit. Just let the quinoa get just a little golden and then to sort of absorb the spices. Then I'm going to add the coconut milk. And aside, also add tomato paste. I'm going to cook that down a bit. I guess one thing to reminisce about regarding food on my trip to Senegal was that I had some very good food from restaurants and also homemade cooking from the friend that I was staying with who has lived back and forth between New York and Senegal for a number of years. So she's quite astute in the cooking and food ways there. They like a lot of seafood. Uh, so I had fish and shrimp, mostly monkfish in particular, with just the right. I was really amazed by the food is kind of spicy, but it's not overbearing. So that little kick with the pepper was just enough. And I was always, no matter where I ate, I was always surprised by that and very, very pleased because one of the I like spice, but one of the things that's not good for the palate is especially if you're not used to a lot of spice, is to eat something and it's kind of overbearing with the heat and the pepper. So that was good. So I'm still simmering this a bit. And according to the recipe, supposed to cook this about 3 minutes or so. And I'm going to, in a few seconds, add what you're supposed to add is chicken stock. I don't have chicken stock, but what I have over here to the side is some water with some of the leftover remnants from the baked chicken that I made. So I'm going to add that. And this is what I mean by cooking what you have on hand. So adding that to the pot, gonna let that simmer for a few minutes. Probably not as long as it should, given that we're only gonna be together for about a half hour or so. But I'll let that cook for a bit. And then I'm gonna add peanut butter. I'm a crunchy peanut butter kind of person, so the recipe didn't say smooth or crunchy, but I'm doing crunchy because that's what I have. And it's going to be 2 tablespoons. I don't quite measure, so just gonna put 2 dollops in there, 2 nice healthy dollops. Okay. That to the side. Gonna stir that until the peanut butter is dissolved in the mix. And gonna move this camera over just a bit so you can see inside. So that's cooking very nicely. Peanut butter is just about dissolved. So getting back to my visit to the country, I thought it was quite apropos that this trip was planned while I was reading the book. So I'm very grateful for that experience. I've always wanted to go to Senegal, particularly to visit Gorée Island, because we all know about how it was one of the launching points for the enslaved to be brought across to the Atlantic area. And so I got the opportunity to go and with a friend's friend, and who I mentioned earlier who lives over there part-time and has a house. So that was very fortunate for me. And also fortunate in terms of going and being there with someone who was very familiar with the country and the lay of the land. We also went during a time where there was a biannual art festival. I don't speak French, so I'm not going to try to pronounce the title in French, but anyway, it is a festival that's held every other year. And that was just a fabulous experience because my visit was full of exposure to arts, musicians, writers, music. It was just fantastic. And so that's something that I'll hold in my mind and spirit for a lifetime. So this food is the sauce is just about ready. And stir it just a little bit more. And so the trip involved going to a lot of exhibits. I'm doing a blog that will be posted before the month is out, and it'll show a lot of pictures and talk a little bit more about the trip. I got to visit Gorée Island. I was a bit disappointed. It was just very commercial to me. And given the fact that I was just landing in the country right after our election, I was quite sensitized by certain things. And so going to Gorée Island and seeing tourists, particularly white tourists, posing in the doorway of no return just was a little bit too much for me. So I'm multitasking here. So I'm adding the shrimp, and I'm going to add the chicken wings. But nevertheless, I can say now that I've been to Gorée Island. There were art exhibits on the island as well from the festival. So that was nice. And then an added piece was again my friend, because she knows just all kinds of folks there. We trekked up this rather steep hill to visit one of her artist friends, and that was very nice. He had beautiful pieces. I actually got a piece from him, and so the trek up there in the heat was well worth it in the long run. So I've got the shrimp and the chicken in here, and they're really covered by the juice, or sauce rather. And now I'm getting ready to add the greens and fish sauce. So I'm going to add the fish sauce first. Again, I don't necessarily measure. Plop the greens in here. I feel so fortunate to be able to go outside into the garden and just pick what I need. I don't grow a whole lot of different things, but I grow enough and it feeds me, and I'm also able to gift my extras to neighbors and friends. So the real big greens harvest that I had in October, I actually, when I harvested them, I gave probably half to my neighbor who's been so nice and watching the garden when I'm off on my various trips. So I'm going to pull the camera over again so you can see. It looks beautiful, doesn't it? You can see the sweet potatoes, the greens, the chicken, and the shrimp. Beautiful color. So I'm going to turn that down a little bit. Slowly simmer. I've had this darn electric stove for a few years now, but I grew up with gas and it's still taking me time to get used to, acclimating the temperature control. And because I'm going to let this simmer for a little while, I'm going to actually add just a tad bit of water, just so everything will have time. It won't take those greens long because they're baby greens. And I find even with the more mature greens, I don't use any kind of sprays or anything. So my garden is survival of the fittest. And in Mississippi, that can be really a challenge, but it's what I do. I don't say my garden is organic, but I don't use any sprays or anything unless it's like neem oil or something like that. But I find that my greens, even when they're mature, are very tender. They're clean. It doesn't take much to, all I have to do is just rinse them off. It doesn't take much to clean them. And they're very tender, like I said, and they don't take long to cook. So sometimes I will take some and I'll just saute them in a skillet with various spices or what have you. And it works just fine. So I'm going to put the top on this, put my spoon over to the side, and I've turned the fire down and I'm going to let that simmer until it's done. This is my first time making this, so the recipe doesn't really say how long to cook it. But they say to stir and combine until the greens are slightly wilted. So I'm gonna let mine cook for a little bit and see how that goes. Now, to get back to the book, I guess some of my major takeaways from the book, first of all, I liked reading the book because I have an agricultural background, having worked at the U.S. Department of Agriculture on the research side and helping to conduct nutrition research, but also to manage and direct agricultural research. So I am particularly interested in agrarian-based places. And so reading about peanuts, and particularly the relationship between peanuts and slavery, was especially interesting to me. What was also just very, very important was reading a book that talked about the impact of slavery on the African side. So, being here in the US, we hear about slavery, and we are familiar about slavery in the US and the Caribbean, but we don't really talk much about its impact on the African side. And what Jori Lewis does in this book is give this story from that perspective. And so that was something very enlightening, and it sort of brings full circle to having a bit more understanding about our story, the story of enslaved people, but also the story of how slavery is not our complete history. People who were enslaved were either captured from war or just downright thievery. And all of that comes out in her book. And because she's focusing on the cultivation of peanuts, she talks about how people, while slavery existed in Africa eons ago, vis-a-vis the Arabs or other colonizers, it was sort of bumped up in the Senegal, Gambia area with the advent of growing peanuts, which were very labor intensive. And so her book describes how people were enslaved more so to support the peanut industry. And initially in the US, peanuts, white plantation owners or industrialists or whomever viewed peanuts as food to feed the enslaved. And not until the advent of sports events like baseball did having roasted peanuts at a baseball game become interesting to a couple of companies that then began truly importing peanuts for that purpose, that sole purpose. Another interesting takeaway is that while slavery ended in various parts of the world at various times, the French, who were the major colonizers of Senegal, banned slavery at some point, but they did it sort of with a wink, in that knowing how labor intensive it was to grow peanuts, they took a blind eye to farmers and growers who still had enslaved people growing the peanuts. And it wasn't until 1905, well into the 20th century, was slavery abolished. And even then, there probably were occasions where the law was not followed. So that was a very interesting takeaway. Having gone to the country, you still see the French influence. Not only, people speaking French, but between the French and the Chinese, the country is sort of owned in many respects by those two entities. One prime example was I was staying in a village that was about an hour or so outside of Dakar. And to get to Dakar, there was a major highway. Half of the highway had been built by the French, and the other half had been built by the Chinese. It was a toll road, and they had two different systems. So one system was French and one system was Chinese. So it was like, welcome to the world. Another major takeaway was the influence of religion. For example, the Catholic Church had a strong base in Gori, and the Protestant Church didn't appreciate that. They wanted to come in with their missionaries. And then also Gori Island, because it was a launching point for the enslaved, Gori Island was very important, and it had a strong Catholic base. So a good portion of the book talks about how the Protestant church came into the country very aggressively, began to not only bring their own country missionaries, but they began to proselytize and train what they called the native folks to, and particularly men, to become native missionaries. And that was a very interesting dynamic to see, but it's a familiar, a very familiar dynamic when it comes to countries that go in and take over. They send the military along with the church, irrespective of the religion, and that's how they begin to take control. What's nice about the book, though, at the end, it talks about how there was a very strong movement of enslaved people who sought their freedom, especially when the so-say emancipation was proclaimed. and farmers or industrialists were not following that law, there was a lot of runaways. And there, amongst the missionaries, there were a group who actually helped set up, hide, move, what have you, enslaved runaways. So it was not, so the slavery there was by no means passive. And even though it lasted into the 20th century, there was a constant movement of enslaved people, free people fighting to not only maintain freedom for the Senegalese people, but to also acquire land, establish villages and towns, and make a world, a new world for themselves. So with that said, I would definitely recommend reading Slaves for Peanuts by Jori Lewis. It's somewhat of an academic read when you first start, but the story, the whole dynamic of what's being told is so interesting that you are drawn in and want to read it to the very end. So again, if you do have an interest, please read it and learn about not only the history of enslavement, but the history of enslavement from an African perspective. Now, let me check this stew. It's boiling nicely. I don't want it to burn. Ooh, it smells good, y'all. Smells good. Oh my goodness, it's beautiful. Sure. The potatoes, that's the other thing, because these potatoes were fresh. I want to be sure that they cook as well. I'm going to let this still simmer. But it is looking good. And the quinoa works perfectly. Wonderful. Turn this darn thing down just a little bit more. And oh my goodness, I just love the color. It is wonderful. It looks wonderful. So with that said, it's a Sunday afternoon. It's a little bit cool here where I am in the Mississippi Delta, but it's a beautiful, gorgeous day. And I hope that I've imparted a little bit of information to you. You might be interested in looking up Marcus Samuelsson's book, The Rise, the cookbook, and looking at the recipes and perhaps even following this recipe. And with that, I guess I'll say goodbye and take care. Happy holidays, since we're a couple of days from Christmas and the new year. Stay safe and stay woke. Bye, y'all.